What's going on, man? Welcome back to the basement. I'm Ron, and we're going to be doing some myth busting today. I know we all grew up watching, I can't remember their names right now, but you know, the Mythbusters. They would go up to the top of the Empire State Building. Oh, if you drop a penny off the top, would it kill somebody? We're not going quite to that extreme or quite in depth like that. But we've been doing that in the fantasy football space a little bit recently, and I kind of want to make this a little bit of a mini series where we kind of challenge the consensus in fantasy football. We did one of these videos a couple weeks ago where we talked about how we got to say no to fantasy PTSD. If a player has burned us in the past, like a Joe Mixon, we should actually be jumping on that discount because people are souring on him. We shouldn't be fading him because of it. Now, today we're going to be talking about why consistency in fantasy football is largely overrated. I know a lot of people, they go out there, they use these consistency ratings from ESPN, CBS, whatever, and they care about, oh, how often does this guy finish as a wide receiver one or an RB1 for my team, and how often is he busting? And everyone's kind of buying into this, and it's the reason why they're fading a guy like Tyler Lockett, who finished top 12 31% of the time, while finishing outside of the top 36 56.25% of the time. But today, we're going to be busting the myth of consistency, and I'm going to be telling you guys why it's largely overrated in fantasy football, especially at wide receiver. Let's not waste any time. Make sure you go down below, subscribe, leave a like. Let's go. Let's first go over why consistency is overrated as a whole, and there's a few reasons. And the first is that a lot of these consistency metrics are kind of arbitrary. You know, they focus in on how often is your running back or wide receiver finishing in the top 12, top 24, top 36. These are arbitrary cutoffs defined by us. A lot of these guys in the top 12 in a given week might come off waivers. So I know that 12 is because there's 12 people in the league, but there might be running backs or wide receivers that finished in the top 12 that weren't, one, they weren't started, or two, they were on the waivers. Now, with that being said, I think your first instinct is to say we want reliable fantasy options. And I know that that's a given. We want to win our weekly matchups because they're decided by a few points every week. And we want to have bankable, reliable players on our fantasy teams. But I'd push back on this idea. And one of the true godfathers of fantasy football, I love citing these guys that are kind of unknown by the vast amount of fantasy gamers. But a guy like Adam Harstad over at Football Guys is really good. He had a great article where he covers this idea, and he goes over the dangers of common sense in terms of consistency. And I'm going to put the link to this article in the description. It's completely free to read. I really suggest that you go read it if you're a big believer in consistency. And he says that the reason why consistency matters is because it's our first instinct. It's common sense. You know, he looked at one of his leagues and he said that 3rd through 6th averaged 101.3, 99.3, 98.3, and 97.8 points per game. So the difference between the 3rd best and the 6th best team was less than a 1.5% difference. And then here's the thing though, that on the surface, when we look at that, we think, okay, we need consistency because these matchups are getting decided in close matchups, but that's false. He did a really cool study where he went through a few of his leagues that start 1 quarterback, 2 running backs, 3 wide receivers, a tight end, a flex, and a defense. And he asked the question of, if you added Jamal Charles' weekly total of 25.33 points per game to the losing team, how many times would that losing team have won their matchup? So basically, the winning team has their 9 players, and the losing team has their 9 players plus Jamal Charles, excluding the playoffs, because the playoffs, you know, the bad teams don't really set their lineups, whatever. Now, he found that the losing team only won 52.6% of the games if they added Jamal Charles. So about a coin flip of the time, you are losing by so many points that even adding a free Jamal Charles to your lineup wouldn't have changed the outcome. So if the majority of games are such massive blowouts that adding the best player in fantasy football, remember this article is from like 2014, so Jamal Charles was that dude, it wouldn't have really mattered in the slightest. So how much good is it that we're targeting consistent players and targeting and fading the boom/bust ones? And it's not really a big benefit at all. It's just a kind of a flaw of logic and common sense. And it's because we remember the games that are decided by a few points. You know, we have those nightmares where it's Monday night and you're going up against your buddy and you lose by 0.7 and you just say to yourself, man, if I just had more consistency, I would have won. But I think we need to step back and say, man, if I had some more guys that could go off for a boom week, I could have won by 20 points. Now, if you don't believe Adam Harstad, I went out and did this with my home league just to make sure that what he said is true. And I encourage you to do the same. Go look at how these games are decided. Go look how many games are decided by 1 point, 2 points, 3 points, how many were decided by absolute blowouts. And just to say, this was one of our most competitive seasons in my home league, with half of the teams going 7-6 or 6-7. The average winning team in my league was winning their matchup by 28.27 points. So consistency isn't really winning you weeks when the games are often blowouts. Now, what that tells us is that consistency is overrated altogether. You're not getting a huge edge when matchups are often decided by blowouts, but I will say there's some merits to having some kind of weekly floor, some kind of, okay, these players will be the foundation of my team. And I think that really only applies at quarterback and running back. Those are the most stable positions that we have. I think the biggest misconception in fantasy is that wide receiver can ever be consistent. Wide receiver consistency is not only false, it's overrated, and it doesn't really exist. Only the top few wide receivers are actually consistent in a given year. So last year, outside of Tyreek Hill, Stephon Diggs, and Devontae Adams, it was a shit show. There wasn't a lot of wide receivers providing usable weeks on a consistent basis. So to show this, I put all of the top 24 wide receivers in points per game, and I showed how many of them were finishing as a wide receiver 4 or worse. And this chart shows that half of them finished as a wide receiver 4 or worse 33% of the time. 1/3 of the time, a top 24 wide receiver in your lineup was busting your team. So 1/3 of the time, your wide receiver 1 or wide receiver 2 were giving you bust weeks. And as I said, wide receivers as a whole are inconsistent. They're boom bust assets as a whole. Every wide receiver is boom bust besides the top. And on the opposite side of the spectrum, we see that from the floor perspective. Of the top 24 wide receivers in points per game, 66% of them were finishing as top 12 wide receivers 1/3 of the time or worse. So they're not giving you the floor to begin with. We should actually be targeting these wide receivers that are labeled boom bust because you're getting a discount on them. It doesn't matter, and consistency isn't even sticky year to year. And a good friend of mine, Cooper Adams over at DLF, proved this on Twitter using consistency ratings of wide receivers year to year. And he found, you're going to see this on this chart, he found that there was literally zero correlation, a 0 R² from year to year in terms of wide receivers having sticky consistency. A wide receiver can be a boom wide receiver one year, and then he can be a consistent wide receiver the next. It doesn't matter year to year. So fading wide receivers because they were boom bust one year, fading them that next season makes almost no sense. Now let's see what this actually looks like in practice. Not only does consistency not matter, but it isn't predictive year over year. And we can see this with DeAndre Hopkins in 2020. He was inconsistent in 2020. He finished as a wide receiver 3 or worse over 40% of the time. But in 2018 and 2019, he finished as a wide receiver 3 or worse only like 29% of the time, which is much better. He also finished as a wide receiver 2 at a 25% rate during the 2018 and 2019 seasons, whereas he only finished as a wide receiver 2 6% of the time in 2020. As I said, there is no consistency here. There's no consistency from year to year in terms of wide receiver consistency. There's no stickiness of consistency at the wide receiver position. Wide receivers as a whole, not only they are not consistent, but they're not year to year consistent. One guy can be super consistent one year and then the next he's not. Another example just off the top of my head, Robbie Anderson's this big boom bust, spike week guy on the a deep threat type of wide receiver. Last year he was one of the most consistent wide receivers on a PPR top 36 basis. And on the other side of that spectrum, Jamison Crowder, one of the guys that we think in our head, PPR monster, slot guy, he's a really consistent wide receiver. He was one of the biggest boom bust wide receivers last year. These profiles that we put on these wide receivers like a Mike Evans, they're not actually boom bust wide receivers every year. It's kind of just random the way it works. Now I say all that to come to a verdict, and the idea is what can we take away from this? And I think as a whole, consistency doesn't matter that much in fantasy football because weekly matchups are often decided in blowouts. Despite what our memory tells us where, man, it was a really close game, I wish that I was just more consistent. I know it's what your mind wants to tell you, and it's kind of just what your bias wants to tell you, but in all reality, most matchups are decided by blowouts, and consistency isn't that important. Now, if we want to take that a step further and you want to value consistency at quarterback and running back, I'll let you do that. To me, I'm not even taking into account consistency ratings, who was boom bust last year. I literally don't care. If you want to care with quarterbacks and running backs, I can see it. But in particular, wide receivers are the least consistent as a whole, and even the inconsistent ones can be consistent the next year. So wide receivers, we really need to understand that we don't really need to have consistency from our wide receivers. You're going to be starting 2 to 3 every week, and the idea with wide receivers outside of the top 3 is you're just praying for spike weeks. That's how the wide receiver position actually works. We just have to accept that wide receiver consistency doesn't exist and we can't be chasing it. We need to embrace the randomness of the game and be actually buying these wide receivers. A lot of these guys have that not consistent boom bust label on them, like a Mike Evans, Tyler Lockett, DK Metcalf, DeAndre Hopkins, Adam Thielen. Whoever out there that you're seeing has that narrative of being a boom bust wide receiver probably has a discount at ADP, and we should be targeting them because, as we know, consistency doesn't carry over year to year. So whoever was the guy that burned us last year for not being consistent should be a target this year. Now, I'm not even saying all those wide receivers are biased to me. I actually don't like Adam Thielen, but if you're fading any of those wide receivers for consistency, you're doing it wrong. If you want to fade them because of talent concerns, volume concerns, whatever, then fine. But if you don't like them because they're not consistent and you're concerned about usable weeks, in my opinion, you're doing it wrong. And that's the video. I just wanted to come on here and kind of get that off my chest because that's something I've been thinking about recently. And as always, this kind of idea, the idea of consistency, I have this baked into my rankings. Guys like Tyler Lockett are not going to be way down my rankings because, they weren't consistent enough for us last year. No, I have these guys where they should be, where we're getting them at a discount on the rankings in tiers. It's beautiful on the Google Sheets. I'm telling you guys, for $5, you can hop onto patreon.com/Ron Stewart. I'm going to put it down below in the description, down below in the comments. You can get my rankings and my draft guide for literally $5. You don't have to go get somebody else's draft guide for $25. You can get mine. And on top of that, what other people aren't offering is that with that $5 comes exclusive spots in my Discord where you can literally ask me straight up, oh, should I make this trade? Should I make this start sit? Should I make this pick on the clock? All of that is included in that $5 deal. I'm telling you, you can't get something better elsewhere. Now, with that being said, you can follow me at @RonStewart_ on Twitter. I think we had a great week this week. I'm looking to really kick some things up from now until week 1. So make sure you go down below, subscribe, leave a like, and let me know if you agree with this. Let me know if you can poke any holes in this argument. I do think that I'm pretty firm on the idea that wide receiver consistency is largely overrated, but let me know how you guys feel about it. Now, as always, I'll see you guys in the next one.